Look at a country where people didn't even have food to eat, where poverty was so severe that people lost their lives due to the lack of food. There were no natural resources, and the country was so small that even after zooming in, people couldn't find it on the world map. The population was disproportionately high, with more than 7,000 people living per square kilometer. In contrast, India has 430 people in the same area. But this country did something remarkable, which transformed it from a poor country into one of the richest nations in the world in just a few years. In the past, people in this country died of poverty, but today 1 in every 6 people is a millionaire. It ranks second in the world in GDP per capita and is number 1 in Asia. All this happened because of one man, Lee Kuan Yew, who changed Singapore's destiny. In today's video, you will clearly understand that if you choose the right leader, they can take a country from rags to riches. Look at the world map. Here, this tiny dot. This is Singapore. It's so small that even if you zoom in on the world map, you might struggle to find it. When you zoom in, you'll see the mainland of Singapore. Beside it, there are 64 small islands, some of which are natural and some were artificially created. Another thing to note is that Singapore is a city-state, meaning that Singapore itself is a country with no separate cities. Instead, the entire country is divided into different regions, like the West region or the North region. Singapore's total area is 719 square kilometers. Next to it is Malaysia, and on this side is Indonesia. Singapore's entire border is connected to the sea, and its location is extremely important. This here is the Malacca Strait, and this is the Sunda Strait. The word strait is used because it connects the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea through a narrow path. When 2 different seas or water basins are connected by a path, it is called a strait. This route has been important since the 7th century, not just in today's times. Back then, these routes were crucial for the entire world, as all trade between East Asia and West Asia passed through them. Whether it was Middle Eastern countries, India, or Europe, if anyone wanted to enter East Asia or send goods there, they had to use these 2 routes. Any other route would have been too long. Even among the Malacca Strait and the Sunda Strait, the Malacca Strait was shorter, so it was used more frequently than the Sunda Strait. In the 7th century, there were no seaports, but the kings of Palembang and Sumatra controlled this area and taxed every ship that passed through these routes. Over time, their control waned and other kings came to power. One such king was Sang Nila Utama. During his reign, one day while hunting, he saw a shining island from a distance that he really liked. He went to this island and was told that the area was called Temasek. In that particular place, he saw an animal that he had never seen before in his life. The locals told the king that the animal looked like a lion, which is called Sing in Hindi. From that moment, the king named the area Singapura, and over time, people began to call it Singapore, meaning Lion City. Even today, Singapore's national symbol is the head of a lion. Back then, kings came and went ruling this area, but the importance of this route for traders was increasing rapidly. The countries that understood this realized that controlling this particular area would be highly profitable. So, thinking of many things, from the year 1509 to 1511, the Portuguese gradually took complete control of this area, known as the Strait of Malacca, and built several small seaports in the Malacca Strait. Building seaports helped ships traveling long distances find a place to stop, repair, or get maintenance done. This also helped develop a good business system within the area, which was very beneficial. Seeing all this, the Dutch company also became very concerned, thinking that if things continued like this, they would suffer greatly. So in 1603, the Dutch company used its forces to defeat the Portuguese and took control of this area. The Dutch and Portuguese fought many battles over control of the Strait of Malacca, but the Dutch forces were stronger, so ultimately the entire control of the Strait of Malacca came under the Dutch. On one side, the Dutch and Portuguese were busy fighting, while on the other, the British East India Company was already ruling India and making money there. They were also trading in South Asia and had established colonies for that purpose. They too needed this route for their trade and wanted to secure it somehow. However, the East India Company didn't want to engage in a direct fight with the Dutch, so they left the Strait of Malacca as it was and instead sent their British officer Thomas Stamford to the area known as Singapore, which was controlled by the Sultan of Johor. On the 6th of February 1819, Stamford convinced the Sultan of Johor to sign a treaty. According to this treaty, the British would pay the Sultan 8,000 Spanish dollars in exchange for control of the entire Singapore area, allowing them to do as they pleased there. Now, the British had control over Singapore while the Dutch managed their seaports in the Strait of Malacca. Even though there wasn't a direct fight between them, a kind of competition started between the Dutch companies in Malacca Strait and the East India Company in Singapore. Because of this competition, the fate of the small island of Singapore began to change. The East India Company, determined to outdo the Dutch, began developing large seaports in Singapore, which kick-started infrastructure development in Singapore. The British started providing extraordinary services at these ports, and to beat the Dutch, they announced that the Singapore port would be free of charge for ships from any country, meaning that no taxes would be levied on business-related activities at this port. When this announcement was made, more and more ships from other countries began to dock at this port. The East India Company's strategy was that although they weren't collecting taxes from the ships, which was a loss, the increased trade in Singapore would bring significant profits in the long run. The Singapore port also had another advantage. Its coastal slope was excellent, meaning that the slope between the water and the land was ideal. If the slope was poor, ships would be at risk. This made the Singapore port a preferred choice for people. Because of this, people from China, India, and Malaysia began coming to Singapore, which was previously an isolated island. As the population began settling in Singapore, the problem was that there was no proper administration in Singapore. The British were focused on making money from and securing the ports, with no concern for the growth and development of the local population working there. Due to the lack of proper administration, illegal activity started to rise. Singapore's port became more infamous for illegal activities than for its business. People from different countries came to Singapore to indulge in opium, gambling, slave trading, and commercial sex work. Violence increased significantly, and traders entering through this route viewed Singapore as a den of vice. The British treated the workers there as nothing more than a labor class working for low wages. Beyond that, they had no concern. As a result, the money the British were earning at that port was not as much as they had expected. Meanwhile, nearby in China, the British noticed that the Chinese were making a lot of money because the sea near China was yielding many natural resources, which they were selling worldwide, including to the UK. Seeing all this, the British were not happy with China either, feeling that they were paying too much to the Chinese without having anything of their own that China needed. Trade benefits both countries only when it flows both ways. To counter this, the British adopted a bizarre strategy. They didn't have any product on which the Chinese people were dependent, so they identified a product and began exporting it to China. The product was opium, and it spread rapidly throughout China. The opium addiction that started in China gradually reached Singapore as well, as most of the labor in Singapore was Chinese. If we look at the data from 1847, by that year, the population of Singapore, which was once a deserted island, had reached 70,000, out of which 40,000 were Chinese. Out of this population, 15,000 people were addicted to opium. You can imagine the state of the streets where so many people were addicted. The majority of Singapore's population worked hard for the British for little pay, with no support or entertainment. And instead of doing something productive, they became addicted to this drug. The situation was such that as we offered tea to guests, people in Singapore began offering opium to each other when visiting. Opium addiction had become so widespread that people had no money, leading to theft and robbery. Poverty was already rampant, and this only worsened the situation. But then something happened that improved the situation in Singapore. In November 1869, the traffic of the Malacca Strait and Sunda Strait was divided. But when the Suez Canal opened, traders started using this route because the previous route was becoming shorter for them. The route from England to China was shortened by 5,000 miles, which significantly increased the importance of the Strait of Malacca and the nearby Singapore. From here, the trade at the Singapore port boomed, and traders from all over the world began coming to Singapore. The demand for manpower increased, and people from nearby countries started coming to Singapore to work, leading to a rise in Singapore's population. As the population grew, the British were forced to create rules and regulations and pay attention to administration. They had to deploy police and soldiers and build infrastructure according to the needs of the labor force. Because of this, Singapore, which was a British colony, began functioning like a proper country. But then in 1914, World War I began. Now, this war had nothing to do with Singapore, but since Britain was involved, the British focus shifted to the war. Moreover, the global trade was heavily impacted by the war, which significantly affected Singapore, a trading hub for Europe and Asian countries. The work at the Singapore port, which sustained many people, also came to a halt, leading to increased unemployment, and even basic necessities like food became scarce. Fights and violence became more common. The opium addiction was already present. And on top of that, in 1918, the Spanish flu pandemic hit the world, including Singapore, killing thousands of people. After this, the Great Depression struck in 1929, making things even worse for Singapore. Then, in 1939, World War II began, which further deteriorated the situation. In this war, Japan and Britain were on opposite sides. On the 8th of February 1942, Japan attacked Singapore, and within just 7 days, the Japanese army defeated the British army, killing thousands of British soldiers. After entering Singapore, the Japanese army committed brutal atrocities, killing civilians in public places, burning people alive, enforcing forced labor, and many other forms of torture on the common people. At that time, anyone who saw the condition of Singapore could never have imagined that it would one day become one of the richest countries in the world. While Japan was wreaking havoc in August 1945, the United States dropped a nuclear bomb on Japan, causing massive destruction and forcing Japan to surrender and leave Singapore. The British then re-entered and took control of Singapore once again. This was the time when the people of Singapore were starving for even a piece of bread. When the British returned, they made some changes. They realized that without proper administration, their port operations would also suffer. Keeping this in mind, the British made administrative changes and granted self-governance to the people of Singapore, allowing them to form a government, hold elections, and manage their domestic issues. However, the British retained control over Singapore's international relations and security. After this, in 1959, general elections were held in Singapore. There were a total of 51 seats, and Lee Kuan Yew, who formed the People's Action Party, won 43 of them, becoming the Prime Minister of Singapore. He was the man who completely transformed Singapore. On one hand, the British were focused on making money from the Singapore port, but on the other, Lee's vision completely changed Singapore's national, economic, and social situation, earning him the title of the founding father of the nation. He achieved all this in a unique way that no one has been able to replicate to this day. People try, but they don't succeed. You might argue that Singapore's good location played a role in this transformation, but countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand also had excellent locations. What made Singapore different was the activities undertaken by Prime Minister Lee. So let's discuss what exactly he did. As soon as Lee Kuan Yew became the Prime Minister of Singapore, he knew that if Singapore didn't stand on its own, it wouldn't survive as a country. He feared that if the British ever left, no one knew how security and other aspects would be managed. Singapore had a large Chinese population, and communist powers like the Soviet Union and communist China had their eyes on Singapore, hoping to establish a communist government there. This was one of the challenges PM Lee faced. But the bigger challenge was that Singapore was plagued by poverty, slums, hunger, opium dens, crime, and racial unrest at a level that was unmatched anywhere in the world at that time. Unemployment was rampant, food was scarce, and yet every week some group of workers would go on strike. The people of Singapore were highly divided, caring only about their own communities. Singapore as a nation mattered to no one. Everyone was concerned only with their own community. The areas were also divided along community lines: Chinese in the downtown area, Malays in Kampong Glam, and Indians in Serangoon. Because the country wasn't united, Singapore suffered greatly. PM Lee first decided that the entire country must be united, or any policy he introduced would be ineffective. Upon becoming prime minister, he created Singapore's national flag and national anthem. Their national anthem is so short that it is printed on the back of their currency. To tackle these issues, in February 1960, PM Lee created the Housing and Development Board, HDB, to address the problem that 70% of the population was living in slums divided by different communities. The HDB bought land and built large housing units, providing the slum dwellers with very cheap housing. For those who couldn't afford it, the houses were given on lease, and those who had jobs could use their Central Provident Fund, CPF, to pay for them. This CPF could only be accessed after retirement, but Lee made a change allowing it to be withdrawn for medical emergencies or house building. As a result, within a few years, the slums were transformed into buildings, and the government deliberately allocated mixed populations in the buildings to encourage unity. Lee understood that to eliminate religious discrimination, it was crucial to stop favoring any one religion or caste. Equal respect and equal opportunities had to be created for all religions, and this had to start at the school level to eliminate the issue at its root. At that time in Singapore, Malay children went to Malay schools, Chinese children to Chinese schools, and other communities to their preferred schools. To address this, Lee established government schools with much better infrastructure and facilities than these community-based schools, offering them at a very low cost. When people saw the facilities and education quality they could get for a low price, they preferred to send their children to government schools rather than community-based ones. In these schools, the government emphasized the importance of respecting all religions and living together in unity. In children's fancy dress competitions, for example, a Chinese child might wear traditional Malay attire to perform. This kind of culture was developed in schools, and teachers were also instructed accordingly. After this, PM Lee created the Ministry of Culture, which had the same aim of uniting the people. They organized cultural events in multiple languages instead of just one, and in many places the Chinese participated in Malay cultural events and vice versa. The majority population in Singapore consisted of those who spoke Chinese, Malay, Tamil, and English, so these four languages were made the official languages. While PM Lee succeeded in uniting the country, Singapore's economy was still heavily reliant on tin and rubber products, and the control of these products was in Malaysia's hands as they were the largest importer. Additionally, Singapore had no natural resources to generate revenue. Moreover, security was still managed by the British. If the British ever left, it would take only 2 minutes for any country to destroy Singapore's existence. From day one, PM Lee felt that the support of Malaysia was crucial. He constantly tried to keep Malaysia happy, even declaring Malay as Singapore's national language, recognizing the Malay origin of Singapore. PM Lee believed that this would reassure Malaysia that Singapore was not a separate entity but shared the same roots, and if any trouble arose, Singapore would support them. In fact, PM Lee even wanted Singapore to become a state of Malaysia. While all this was going on, PM Lee was also of the opinion that all the efforts being made to unite Singapore and implement various policies would be in vain if corruption persisted. In June 1960, he passed the Prevention of Corruption Act, which stipulated that anyone caught engaging in corruption, whether in the public or government sector, would face a penalty of 100,000 Singapore dollars or imprisonment of 5 to 7 years, or both. To investigate corruption cases, the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, CPIB, was established, and this entire department was kept completely independent from government control, reporting directly to the Prime Minister. In 1961, PM Lee established the Economic Development Board, EDB, with the main purpose of improving Singapore's economy by attracting foreign investment, despite the lack of natural resources. The strategy was to offer tax benefits to companies that set up industries in Singapore, sometimes even offering a tax holiday for 1 or 2 years, meaning they wouldn't have to pay any taxes during that period. While PM Lee was taking all these small steps, he was also holding back-to-back meetings with Malaysia, hoping to merge Singapore with Malaysia. His main goal was to eliminate his concerns about security and to take advantage of Malaysia's larger market, which would open up more opportunities for Singapore's growth. PM Lee believed that by merging with Malaysia, Singapore's growth would be faster and more robust. However, he didn't want to impose his decision on the people, so in 1961, a merger referendum was held, and the people voted in favor of merging with Malaysia. Following this, the merger took place, and Singapore officially became a state of Malaysia on the 16th of September, 1963. The condition was that Singapore would become a state of Malaysia and contribute 40% of its annual revenue to Malaysia's central government. Singapore would manage its education and labor policies, but defense, foreign affairs, and security would be handled by the Malaysian government. Additionally, Singapore was given 15 seats in the Malaysian parliament. PM Lee readily accepted all these conditions. On the 16th of September 1963, Singapore officially became a state of Malaysia. However, on the 1st of March 1964, when Singapore had already become a state of Malaysia, PM Lee announced that his party, the PAP, People's Action Party, would participate in the upcoming general elections in Malaysia. This was the first time the Malaysian government began to feel uneasy because Singapore had both Malay and Chinese populations, and they were concerned that the Singaporean political party might become too powerful and overshadow their own. While these issues were unfolding, on the 21st of July 1964, during the celebration of Prophet Muhammad's birthday by Malaysian Muslims in Singapore, a dispute arose between them and the Chinese Muslims in Singapore. The situation escalated into riots, resulting in the deaths of 23 people and the injury of hundreds. The violence didn't stop there. A month later, riots broke out again between the Malays and the Chinese. When these incidents were discussed within the Malaysian government, they approached PM Lee and advised him to favor the Malay population, as Malaysia was a Malay majority country. They suggested that doing so would be politically advantageous and that the Chinese should be given less priority. PM Lee, however, firmly refused. He explained that after years of working towards unity, it would not be right to create divisions now. For him, all religions were equal. At this point, the Malaysian government realized that it had made a mistake by merging with Singapore, as Singapore was not willing to follow their directives. Fearing that Singapore might become a political threat, they arrested Lee and other Singaporean leaders. However, Malaysian Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman intervened, and on the 9th of August 1965, Singapore was expelled from Malaysia, becoming the only country in the world to be forcibly granted independence. On the same day, PM Lee held a press conference and announced the formation of the Republic of Singapore as a democratic and independent country. However, he did not want to separate from Malaysia, and during the press conference, he even broke down in tears. Despite this, PM Lee quickly realized that no one would come to save Singapore and they would have to fend for themselves. At the same time, another challenge arose. The British, who were conducting their own calculations and elections, decided that they would reduce their military expenses and withdraw from colonies where profits were low and losses were high. On the 18th of July, 1967, the British announced that they would withdraw from Southeast Asia, including Singapore. And by 1970, they had fully withdrawn their forces. This decision greatly troubled PM Lee and the people of Singapore because the British military not only provided security, but also employment, allowing people to earn enough to eat. PM Lee had no immediate solution to provide employment for so many people at once. He went to London pleading with the British to reconsider, but his efforts were in vain, and the British calmly left Singapore. At this point, Singapore was completely isolated. Whatever little employment existed had diminished, and the security situation was dire. They only had 2 battalions of about 1,000 soldiers each, 2 ships, and no air force at all. Despite this, they began building their own armed forces and moved forward as best they could. Faced with a do-or-die situation, Prime Minister Lee began taking rapid steps. The first thing he did was engage in back-to-back discussions with Southeast Asian countries, eventually forming the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, with Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Thailand as members. The goal was for these countries to support each other economically, maintain peace in the region, and provide mutual assistance in times of need. Next, in June 1968, PM Lee established the Jurong Town Corporation. Jurong refers to the area in Singapore's west region, and PM Lee decided to turn this area into an industrial hub where foreign companies could come and set up their businesses. The question arose, why would foreign companies choose to set up their businesses in Singapore? To address this, PM Lee offered several incentives. Some industries were made tax-free, while others were given tax holidays, allowing them to set up their businesses without worrying about taxes for several years. PM Lee also introduced labor laws that were highly favorable to companies. Most of the control over the labor force in Singapore was in the hands of the companies. Additionally, the local population was so impoverished that they were willing to work no matter the conditions. PM Lee conducted back-to-back meetings, convincing companies from the USA, Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia, Australia, and European countries to set up operations in Singapore. Within just 2 years, more than 250 companies had set up in Singapore, creating over 32,000 jobs. He also established large oil refineries, making Singapore the 3rd largest oil refinery hub in the world. As a result, Singapore's dependency on Malaysia significantly decreased because PM Lee had successfully created numerous jobs within Singapore itself. By 1970, PM Lee had achieved what he set out to do. By that year, not a single person in Singapore was unemployed. In fact, so many jobs had been created that workers had to be brought in from other countries. Singapore's GDP growth rate had reached 13.9%. It was time for Singapore to rank among the richest countries in the world. Orders were pouring into Singapore, and even after bringing in workers from abroad, the work couldn't be completed on time. Despite working overtime, the delivery of orders couldn't be fulfilled. PM Lee then called his officials and said, "In our product manufacturing factories, the focus is on labor-intensive work like textiles, wood products, mosquito coils, etc. These require a lot of labor but generate less profit. If this continues, no matter how much business we get, our growth will eventually stall. We need to do something that requires less labor but generates more money." So he proposed a policy to attract investment in technology and skill-based industries such as machinery, electronic parts, computer parts, and pharmaceutical companies because these industries require less effort and generate more profit. After working on this for a few days in 1973, the Economic Development Board, EDB, announced that investors setting up high-tech industries in Singapore would be given a 5-year tax exemption. This offer was made not only to foreign companies, but also to local companies that upgraded their machinery and staff to improve technology levels, and they too would receive tax incentives. As companies started coming in, the demand for skilled workers skyrocketed. Since the workers in Singapore couldn't secure jobs without technical knowledge, PM Lee collaborated with multinational corporations to open joint industrial training centers. These centers provided hands-on experience without much theoretical knowledge, allowing people to learn quickly. Alongside this, Prime Minister Lee implemented another game-changing strategy. Typically, a country's economy determines the interest rates that banks offer to their customers. At that time, Singapore's economic growth was accelerating rapidly, resulting in banks offering very high interest rates. Singapore became one of the countries with the highest bank interest rates in the world. Normally, when a country offers high bank interest rates, many foreign banks invest in that country's banks. However, in Singapore, 45% of the interest earned from banks was taken by the government, which discouraged foreign banks from showing interest in investing in Singaporean banks. Seeing this, PM Lee decided to eliminate the 45% tax that the government collected from bank interest. This single strategy had a massive impact. Foreign banks began investing heavily in Singapore's banks, turning Singapore into an international financial center. But even then, PM Lee didn't stop. He realized that one more step was necessary. He noticed that while Singaporean workers were manufacturing high technology products, they were producing low value products, which brought in less profit. So he implemented another policy to encourage the production of high value products alongside high technology ones, ensuring that less effort yielded more profit. PM Lee's dream was to make Singapore the richest country in the world. Just think about it. A country that had faced starvation only 20 to 25 years earlier was now daring to dream such a big dream and was making it a reality. To achieve this, the government launched a high salary scheme in 1980, announcing high salaries based on workers' skills. Foreign industries that produced high value products were given even greater tax exemptions than before. The government also allocated a separate budget for a skill development fund, providing subsidies to companies in Singapore that invested in training, research and development, R&D, computerization, and automation to produce high-end products. This initiative was so successful that Singapore became the world leader in high-value product manufacturing. By 1983, Singapore had become the largest exporter of hard disk drives used in computers worldwide. Singapore continued to advance its country, not only in manufacturing, but also in tourism, transport, communication, and services. PM Lee undertook numerous infrastructure projects such as the Singapore Botanic Gardens, Sentosa Island, the Mass Rapid Transit MRT system, and the Singapore Science Park, among many others. These projects brought international recognition to Singapore. Today, Singapore is considered one of the world's safest, cleanest, and most beautiful countries, with the best and most affordable healthcare, a 97% literacy rate, and a top-class education system. It has the most efficient public transport system and the world's best airport. Singapore's GDP per capita is $17,606 US, making it second in the world and first in Asia. 1 in 6 people in Singapore is a millionaire. In recent years, Singapore has even been named one of the world's most expensive cities. Corruption and crime are nearly non-existent. In Singapore, you can be heavily fined or even imprisoned for connecting to Wi-Fi without permission, smoking in public, crossing the road without using a crosswalk, what we call a zebra crossing, littering, chewing gum, selling gum, or even failing to flush a public toilet. The penalties for drug offenses are among the harshest in the world. Even today, countless countries try to replicate Singapore's system, but they fail to become like Singapore because they do not focus on the core issues: unity among the people and zero tolerance for corruption. PM Lee didn't have time for political games or concerns about his position. He thought long term, knowing that if Singapore didn't stand on its own feet, the country wouldn't survive. When a country doesn't survive, there's no point in preserving the prime minister's seat. This is why PM Lee is still remembered and talked about today. Thanks for watching.